In the last video, I slip cast this pot here, which has a new feature, and that's this foot. I modified the mold so it has this pattern built into it. To do that, I took the regular shape cast mold and then used the high resolution files that it creates to modify the foot in CAD. That gave me this, which I 3D printed and then used to pour plaster just like I would any other shape cast mold. That gave me this plaster slip casting mold and in turn that pot. For a first try at modifying the forms, it went pretty well. However, there's some things that I want to improve. In particular, when I poured the plaster, there was plaster that stuck in these tiny features. My intention was to start small, however that caused problems with the plaster. All these features are way too fine. And indeed, if you look at the bone dry pot now, I do have this pattern here, but like some of the inner features here, like this inner ring in particular, that really didn't come out. I think it may still be an interesting effect. I'm going to definitely finish this pot. However, it really wasn't what I was going for. I wanted something much more clean. So this video, I'm going to do just that. I'm going to revise this design idea and do another spin at it. And this is what I came up with. So the idea behind the design is similar. It's basically this radial kind of star pattern, but I made several key changes. One is I made the features much bigger, so there's way less points on the new one relative to the old one. Each of the diamonds is much bigger on the new one, and the step down is larger as well. This one here was basically just a small multiple of the layer height. This one's going down 1 millimeter in each step. And then also I made a transition from each level. These are all sloped down instead of going straight down. While these layers are very thin, they do all go straight down. That was just the easiest thing to do in software, but I think was part of the problem. So this will give me draft angles on the foot, just like I have on the walls and everywhere else. One of the things I neglected to do when I made this design is I did it completely on the computer. This time around, I fixed that mistake. I went ahead and printed this out to scale so I had a better idea of how big it actually was. So even this inner star here, those features are getting pretty small, but they're still at least 1 millimeter big. So I felt much better about that, especially compared to this one where they are really, really tiny. Also realized I had another problem. Since I was just drawing this in CAD and Shapecast wasn't taking care of everything, the form itself was scaled up to account for my clay shrinkage, but the drawing I did was not. So the pattern is actually smaller than I was intending. This time I went ahead and modified that as well. So this is the size of the SVG that's drawn for Shapecast. And I went ahead and wrote some code, just some prototype code for myself that went ahead and scaled that up. So this should be the final pattern that is the fired size, while this is our mold size. The other thing I did for myself was that these are different colors, and each color basically represents a different depth. So the white outer circle is just the area that we're trying to deal with in the pot. The dark black then is the first transition, the next gray is the next area, the next transition, and so on to the white, which is the full depth. In this case, 3 millimeters. And just like this mold, I went ahead and extended the inner part as well, because the thickness of the 3D print right here isn't that thick. So if I were to cut down this much in the normal shapecast mold, and this one in particular, the original, this would be poking through. So I didn't want that. So I went ahead and extended it out. I wrote a little bit of custom software for this just to make my life easier, but you could do this completely manually as well. In my last video, I gave a little bit of an overview of how to do that. So the real goal of this video is to try and make the plaster again and see if we wind up with a better result. Also, in printing this out, I think it is much more the design aesthetic I was originally going for. I think this one's cool, and I think when I finish it, in particular, when I finish the clay itself, I think I'm gonna put like an iron wash on this, and that will really accent the recesses in it. It's gonna be very rustic, just given the way the plaster mold works. But I think having all of these diamond patterns themselves create the foot was much more of what I was going for. So let's go ahead and try this new design. I need to go ahead and measure out the plaster and mix it up. Okay, went ahead and measured out the amount of plaster and water that I need. This is provided automatically by Shapecast, and even though we modified the foot, those modifications are really small volume-wise. So I have 1.75 kilograms of dry plaster and 1.22 kilograms or 1.22 liters of water, or close to it. We'll mix these up, but first we need to get our mold ready. And since these two forms are identical, except for the foot modifications, that means I can use the outer molds from the original that I've reused several times now. In particular these. So let me go ahead and quickly assemble the mold using binder clips. And for this, the only thing I did to get it ready for the mold is I sanded down some of the 3D printed artifacts on the outside. But otherwise, I'm using it straight from the printer. There we go, one mold ready to pour. So now I'm going to go ahead and mix up the plaster. The dry, I'm going to put on the wet. Last time when I was mixing, I noticed I was getting some bubbles, and it's because the volume here isn't very much. And kind of counterintuitively, you get fewer bubbles when you have more volume. And it's really because when it's mixing, you're pulling air down into the plaster when it's a low amount. When it's much taller, that vortex doesn't pull the air down as much. And you really do want to mix this as much as possible, as strongly as possible. Some people mix it by hand, but that's not actually really recommended. The plaster becomes much weaker that way. So I'm going to use my drill attachment still, but instead of this container to mix plaster in, I'm going to try this one here. This was a water container that I went ahead and cut the lid off of. That will force the level of plaster up taller relative to this wider container here, since it's much narrower. So I'll try this. So first put the wet in. And then I've got my sifter here to help make sure there's no clumps going in and to pace me dumping in the plaster. There's all the plaster, and I'll go ahead and let it slake. All right, there we go, 4 minutes. Plaster's thicker than I'd like it. All right, that didn't go quite as smoothly as planned. I'm not sure exactly what happened. Either way, let me go ahead and let the plaster cure, and then we will come back to it. Actually, I just realized the problem. It is pretty warm, so the water probably isn't cold enough, and it's just setting faster. It's been about 45 minutes, and I'm very sure the plaster's cured. So apparently this video is also about what goes wrong with plaster. So what could have gone wrong with this plaster pour? As I was pouring it, it was pretty obvious immediately that it was too viscous. It should be much more runny. You don't want it too runny, but it needs to be more runny. So what could have caused that? As I mentioned, I think the temperature is warm, so the temperature of the water is warmer. That could have contributed to it setting faster. This is also the end of my bag of plaster. However, I used that plaster just last week and it was just fine, so I'm not too sure that's what it is. The longer plaster sits around, the faster it does kick. I think it has a chance of absorbing water from the air. It's possible I got the ratios wrong. However, since I'm underfilled, I don't think I had too much dry plaster. And the reason I'm underfilled is that it was setting and therefore it stuck to the inside of the container. I have some here on the table. Normally I have more than enough. So I'm not too sure that was it either. Either way, what can we do about it? Well, what are the problems? So the first problem is that we underfilled. So the bottom, when we flip it over, is going to not be smooth. So I pulled up my rasp so I can smooth it out if I need to. The other option is we can use the outer mold here, mix up a little bit more plaster and pour it in. The plaster wants to bind to itself, and so as long as we don't put a mold release on there, the crystals will grow and attach to each other. So we could fill it back in. And since this is a basically non-critical part of the mold, that would also work. However, I think the plaster is thick enough that it's all right. The plaster is basically an inch thick, 25 millimeters. And so we're a little bit thinner, but it should be all right. The bigger worry is that we had bubbles on the inner mold. Since it was so thick, there were bubbles against the surface, they could have gotten caught. But there's only one way to find out, and that is to demold it. All right, there we go. And I should mention before the big reveal and seeing if we do have problems, it's worst case that we go ahead and just wash off the mold parts and do it again. These 3D printed pieces are reusable. I've reused these outer pieces many times, and I've done the inner molds before as well. All right, so the bottom surface from where we poured looks okay, so that's promising. And there's a sign of what I was worried about. There we've got a bubble right there. A couple small ones right here. Those are just the outside, so they really don't matter. Normally I would go ahead and clean up the base of the mold, but let's see what we're doing on the inside. Let me go get my frozen mixture of alcohol and water so that we can shrink the mold and pull it out. So I just keep this in my freezer all the time. Pour it all the way in to the top. Of course, it's not sitting flat now. Give it a second. Grab a bucket to catch it all in. The other mold I let sit and cure for a while. This one here, it's because I was worried about these features in the foot. This new one has good enough draft angles that I'm not too worried about it. Yeah, just fine. Ooh, and I get a sneak peek. So how did we do with the mold? Well, much better than I was worried about. So the only bubbles I see are in the wall right here. There could be some thin spots that will wear through eventually, but the critical part down on the bottom looks awesome. And the 3D print, there's some fine plaster dust on here, but there's nothing that broke out or chipped out, not like the last version. So we actually have a really good mold this time, despite our plaster problems. So can those bubbles here be fixed? Kind of. You could mix up a little bit of plaster and try and put it in there. I've just found that to be more problems than it's worth. I'll just clean up the clay when it comes out. It might stick a little bit, so demolding it might be tricky. And the real answer is just like when you're throwing on the wheel and the pot doesn't quite do what you want, is to just go ahead and try again. If I end up liking this mold, I will just make some more. And this one has problems with the clay, then I can just toss it, or I can use it and clean up the resulting pieces once they are in clay. Let me go ahead and deal with this foot now. Since the plaster is still soft, we can kind of rectify the situation here. It's going to make a bit of a mess, so I'm glad I have my boards down. So just have a rasp here. This is just from the kitchen. You can get the fancy pottery ones if you want. Again, this is mostly a non-functional surface. We do need something flat so the slip can sit down in there, or flat-ish. All right, so that's already 1,000 times better. I think that's probably good enough. It's a little bit wobbly, but it is not too bad. And at least it is sitting so that the slip can go down in there, and the slip well is big enough that even though it's slightly at an angle, it'll be all right. All right, there we go. I will go ahead and let this sit for several days to let it finish curing all the way, and then we will try it out. And then we can see how the slip and the clay does. Let's slip cast the new mold. I just mixed up my slip, so we're good to go. There we go. We'll go ahead and let the pot form and then drain it out. I'll give this another 20 or 30 minutes to firm up and then pop it out. All right, we should be good to demold. You can see that's starting to pull away a little bit. I can show you right there on the slip well. Overall, the wonky bottom hasn't been a problem, luckily. It's a little bit rocky, but definitely stable enough. One of the other things I was curious about is what the inside of the pot would look like. Slip deposits a wall along the plaster. It's relatively thin, just a few millimeters. And I was curious if it would follow the contour of our mold. In particular, do we get some sort of transferred version of this foot on the inside of the pot? And at least for this one, it looks like the answer is no. So if we look down in there, it's a little bit hard to see, but it seems pretty smooth. So I think what happened is more slip kind of deposited in those little corners. So if you imagine you have a pot with a corner, we have more plaster area for the given amount of slip that's right there compared to something that was just flat. So if this was just a plaster, we had the same volume. So I think there's more plaster to be able to suck in the water, and therefore the clay will deposit faster. So I think that's what's going on and how that got a little bit more smooth. I think if the features were larger, that probably wouldn't happen. And I've noticed it in some of my other forms before, and most noticeably in the corners of a pot. It definitely shows up there. But it's cool to see here as well. All right, so let's go ahead and trim this and pull it out. And I got my piece of cardboard to catch. Okay, no problem. So luckily the defect in the wall didn't prevent us from demolding. I have to say this foot's really cool. So there it is up close. We do have a few artifacts from the 3D print. I turned on ironing and it wound up with this slightly extra layer right around this inner part here. And I have a small step on the outside as well. And I checked the model and it doesn't look like it's there in the model, so not sure exactly what's going on. But I think a quick sponge will be able to clean those up. And overall, we have a nice crisp foot. So I am very happy with it. I know you can use a tool to go ahead and carve that or depress the clay. I think it's a little bit harder with the slip cast pot just because they tend to be thinner versus a thrown pot where there's more clay to work with. However, I could never get something quite that clean. So I think we made some great progress going from this first attempt where the features were really shallow. That resulted in some of them not transferring into the plaster quite well. This is a more rustic effect. I think it's pretty cool all by itself, but really wasn't what I was going for. So I remember my own advice and printed things out to scale. That's why I have the design proof for the 3D models, but I think it also applied here. So I got something where the features were much more reasonable sized. Printed that out. Had a few issues with my plaster itself, but nothing to do with the molds, and was able to get a decent mold out of it. And wound up with a really cool pot with a really cool foot. I'm having fun with this. I think I might play around with this idea of modifying the foots a little bit more. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.